That's great. Thank you so much, Ali. So now we're moving to our key speaker, and I would like to introduce Ikal Anguli from Friends of Lake Turkana. Ikal is an Indigenous social, cultural, and environmental justice activist. She is the founder and director of Friends of Lake Turkana in Kenya, working to provide women-led community advocacy, as well as meaningful participation of communities in the development and control of their own lands and territories. Ekel promotes the defense and protection of Lake Turkana through securing land, water, and territorial rights, as well as demanding accountability of political and corporate power. So currently she's studying a PhD at the University of Leicester in the Department of Geography, looking into the political ecology of land formalization and how it results in the commodification and dispossession of pastoral lands. She has a master's in public policy from the Department of Political Science from State University of New York, Stony Brook, as well as a bachelor's degree from the University of Nairobi. She has a particular interest in political ecology, examining the relationship between politics, land, Indigenous rights, and resource extraction. And that's something that we spoke about at the last event, as well as environmental policy and politics of energy and natural resources. She's also passionate about exploring the role of debt in natural resource sustainability or unsustainability. She works towards the meaningful participation of Indigenous people in decision-making and control of their territories. Ekel has received a number of awards, including the Goldman Environmental Award, also known as the Green Nobel in 2012, and the Conservation International Fellowship Luke Hoffman Medal, amongst others. And the title of Ekel's talk today is People and Power for a Real and Just Transition. So welcome, Ekel. Oh, Ekel, we can't actually hear at the moment.
So Ikal is in Kenya at the moment, isn't she? So if you just give her a few seconds, we'll see if we can get her.
Just to say that the chat is going to be open. So when, so how the speech is going to run is we're going to have a 10 to 15 minute talk from Ekel, and then the chat box will open for questions, and then we'll do that same again.
Thanks. Thank you very much, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, different time zones. This is what COVID has led us to. We are now meeting in different time zones. So thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Zarina. Thank you, Ali Watson, for the opening speech. Listening to it and think around exclusion, but also as we were waiting, the discussions around the corporate sector. It was really interesting and kind of informed what I'm speaking to. My name is Ikal Anguli. I am working and living in Turkana, northwestern part of Kenya. Do not worry for anyone who doesn't know. A few people have. Third generation have come up here, Bennett and team. So many Kenyans haven't, so privilege. I must say before I start speaking, I actually had applied to Edinburgh for my PhD before I chose Leicester. But this was around Brexit, so the resources available just became too high for some of me. In case my internet gets flaky, I will go offline. I'll be off video just in case I feel that my internet is a bit shaky. It is windy out here. For those in cold weather, sorry, we're enjoying good, nice, hot weather out here. When you talk about a just transition, first, I will fall to the topic, build back better. When you have a very shaky foundation, it's an argument I have with my comrades in the office. When you have a shaky foundation, it doesn't matter how much, good pillars you put on the side, it is a shaky foundation. So we have to start to ask ourselves, do we fall into a trap of the big corporate institutions who are talking about building back? And are we allowing ourselves to disrupt fully? the existing systems. And if we disrupt, then we will not be building back, we will be building afresh. And perhaps something for us to think about as we think through the ideas of building back. Zarina, please give me a sign in case I freeze, just in case. I'm looking at you. Freeze sign. Yeah?
No, you're
so
fine. You're doing well. So carry on.
So when we're thinking about the just transition, we also have to be, and I loved what Professor Watson talked about in terms of who's, inclusion and exclusion around whatever transitions we're talking about, whatever deals we're thinking about, whatever climate related solutions we come up with, who's included and who's excluded. And whenever I think about the just transition, I don't look at it in terms of a climate related issue. It has got to be linked to a total disruption of the current economic and social order, because the economic and social order is what leads to the climate crisis. The need to extract beyond the use, consumption and purchase beyond the current use by citizens or by global citizens is one of the reasons behind the extreme fragmentation of the environment for profit. So for us to talk about the just transition, we cannot talk about a just transition in exclusion of economic and social order. So that's the first place that I think we need to think about. How do we do this? I'm going to sort of put my talk around, and why I said people power and a real change is because many of us grew up in a public system. We went to public school, used public healthcare. I don't know about the situation in Scotland, but within the global south, we see a weakening of the public system, the disruption and fragmentation of common goods and common property, ideally with an intent and intention that works towards the political elite and for private good. So I'm really looking at, and because the conversation, as Zarina mentioned, spoke to what we are seeing in the COVID times. When you look at what's happened over COVID, you see a strained public health system. You see a strained public water system. You see an extremely strained public education system that in the Kenyan context, you see kids studying under trees because we do not have enough school infrastructure to cater for this. Sorry, I will have to go on video because I'm seeing it's off video. So I'm hoping it's okay with everybody. Just give me a minute. I need to do that just because it's flaking. Sorry. So yeah, so when Right,
carry on. I was just going to say, Ikal, on our side, it's actually absolutely fine.
Okay, all right. I was a bit worried because it froze for a bit. So when I really look at just the discussion around education and action for a just transition, I think we have to then recognize that we really have to think about what is the education we are talking about. How do we liberalize the education that we're mentioning here? Because if the education is a private education that excludes people, again, I go back to what Professor Watson was saying, because a private education system it tends to exclude a huge population of people. So how do we make sure that we are liberalizing the education system? But you cannot talk about education without talking about who are the power brokers who then determine this education system. When the education, when it happens, where it happens, who gets it and who doesn't get it. So we have to be alive to the power interests within even our education system. It was interesting during the Black Lives Matter phase when there was a lot of advocacy around it last year, but even before, of education, that it's only the few who can get it, who can access education. So then you exclude some, meaning that you tend to exclude the majority from the action for climate justice. And you cannot talk about education and power without realizing and even thinking around the food systems, because we've got to be able to deal with the now, and that now means needing water, needing food, just needing to sustain yourself to be able to sit in a classroom. And you can see how the current food systems are either privatized, whether it is fertilizer. In Kenya, we had legislation that was trying to that was trying to make illegal the use of organic fertilizer because someone wants to provide this. I'm mentioning all these different things because they are so interlinked, and we tend to sometimes think about climate on its own, food on its own, gender on its own, and various things. Yet they're, all those things are interlinked, and that's why when we start to think about how do we liberalize the education systems, how do we disrupt the economic and social order that would then allow for action that, for change that happens through and the various levels. And I asked about what's the composition of people listening, because young people, they have the energy, and it's so liberating to see how young people can think around it and question the education that they're being given, and ask the key questions around who's providing the water that we are drinking, how are we able to understand our food, where our food comes from and our food systems. It is really important for us to do that, to then address the inequalities, because the fact that we're exacerbating inequalities by the current economic and social order, you find that people are left in a very vulnerable state, that they cannot be able to even demand for change or even participate in the action. I think in thinking around, disrupting the economic and social order, we have to talk about transforming the energy, food, and economic systems. All those things are interlinked. But of course, along with it, the power and the political spaces that we occupy. Inclusivity and participation. Who's participating? Who's speaking for? Who's making legislation? And what are the interests of the corporate parties in the legislations that are happening in our spaces? I get into this work initially from a conflict perspective. I started to look at, I live in a region where there's a lot of conflict, cross-border conflict, ethnic conflict, and mostly it was seen as just an ethnic conflict. But then it's not ethnic. It is linked to, the need for water and pasture for a livelihood, for survival. But in that, you now see an expanding oil sector that is taking up grazing and pastoral lands in a place where it's water scarce. You see an water being taken up from water bodies to be able to pump out the oil, yet citizens do not have access to water. And so I started to look at this conflicts. What is driving the conflicts? And it's really around resources. It really is around a fragmented commons, where what was collective lands used for all is now being privatized through legislations that, tend to create look at land as if it is my land and is not for everyone's land. In a pastoral region where you have user rights, yet the narrative that is brought on the table around formalization of land is towards individualized. And that's why the fascination about an education and where knowledge is produced. And so when we tend to go into communities and we are talking to communities, if we then are bringing in a knowledge base where because I feel like knowledge production has been capitalized. It is for the few who then come in and tell communities, this is what will work for you. This is the direction you should go. Yet not taking into account, where is this knowledge produced? Who has this knowledge? Who's determining what is the packaging of knowledge? The reason I study my PhD is because in Kenya, we are pushing for land laws that is seen to land reforms that is meant to better the lives of people. However, we've been questioning who's pushing for the land reforms. The land reforms was started at the World Bank during the World Bank consensus to basically privatize land in the global south with the intent of making it easier for the corporate sector to acquire land, because the idea that getting a collective, working and negotiating within the commons is harder. So it is easier to disrupt the commons and negotiate between a few community members and the corporate sector. So when I really think about that, I start to ask myself, how do we rethink our education system? How do we not make it about water, but people, not water on its own, but the people and how they relate with the water. Food systems, again, people have got to be part of it. So it's real solutions, real issues, and developing ways that what is out there is really discussed based on the people, and so that the just transition is not romanticized. Because I sometimes feel like when we talk about the just transition, we think about it in terms of fossils. And Jennifer, when you talk about the electric bikes, it is such a great idea. But when I think about it, I'm like, so where, even as we think about the just transition, most of it is looked at from the fossil versus the non-fossil. However, if you look at the DRC, where most of the minerals that the non-fossil sector will need, it is the DRC and places like the Democratic Republic of Congo where these fossils will come from. So you have the cobalt, the aluminum, the lithium that is needed to run this sector. So how do we make sure that the inclusion that Professor Watson was talking about is really there? That the benefits that somebody in Scotland, somebody in the UK, somebody in the US is getting from an electric bike is not in any way the disruption of a child who's mining for the minerals that are needed in the DRC and in other parts of the global south. And that's why the real people aspect needs to be there. So we then start to ask the value chain of what solutions we're coming up with. Where is this mineral coming from? What is this thing that we are defining as renewable? What's the hardware related to the just transition? Where is it coming from? And how do we make sure that it is not in any way disrupting the food systems of others? It is not in any way disrupting the water systems of others, because to mine those minerals that will be needed for the just transition means that people will lose land, means that people's food systems will be disrupted, means that people's water systems will be disrupted. And we may think we are lowering the global greenhouse gas emissions, but how does that relate to the fragmentation of other people in the global south where these minerals are coming from? And if we think about that, then we'll start to ask ourselves, how does the disruption of the economic and social order, not in specific geographies, but across the global ecosystem look like? That when you're buying your solar system in Edinburgh, you can then be able to know through the education system where this comes from and how that contributes to maintaining the economic and social order, even while we're thinking that we are in a just transition. I think I can leave it at that for Jennifer, and then we can pick up from there.
Ikal, thank you so much for your, really passionate words. We can feel your passion. I would just like to take a little bit of a step back, and I think we would love to hear a little bit about your journey and how you became an environmental activist.
Thanks, Jennifer. My journey was an oops. I will not lie that, we did gardening as kids. Mine was an oops. It was something, where you sort of like fall down and then you decide, well, am I getting up or am I staying there? In this particular case, I kind of stayed there. But mostly, my father was a member of parliament in Turkana, and his everyday engagements were really around what's happening in communities. There was a lot of tensions between ourselves and neighboring communities. And at that particular time, I tended to hear a lot about conflict in the region. And I was, at a particular point, you can easily grow up as them versus us, that community versus us. And I found myself a little bit in that space. Along the way, went into high school, university, and kind of like put everything at the back. But at the same time, there was a dam that was being constructed in a part of Turkana, in Turkana South, the Takwal Dam. So I started to kind of find out what was going on a little bit, just as a curious kid. And I think when I finished campus, I really interacted a lot with the conflict sector in the region and tried to find out, when you walk into a conflict zone and you find a mother dead and her baby trying to circle her breasts, the breast of a dead mother, you then start to ask yourself, if, you know, we don't choose where we are born, if either way I could be here, it could be me, because it was a young mother. It could have been me. And so that interest started to really brew inside me. What is the conflict about? How is it that this conflict has gone on for this long? My father's time, my time, and now I'm seeing it within, you know, my grandkids' life, and it's still going on. So I started to look at it. Then after that, I did go and work with Richard Leakey for a bit. And he, being interested in climatology, anthropology, and paleontology, I got to interact with a lot of researchers who were trying to find out what's going on along the Omo River. And so that happened, and I started to come to find out about the Gibe 3 Dam and the developments in the Omo and how that impacted downstream communities. With that, I started to then investigate it, just try to find out, but also linking it to that grounding of conflict, like why the conflict? Why is it that the Dasnach and the Turkana are fighting over the resources within the lake? Why is it that even while the communities are fighting here, their governments are sorry, just a bit of noise behind me. Sorry. Yeah.
No,
so,
that's like me and my kids all the time. We're always having that chat over Zoom.
Yeah, so you know, the communities are fighting over resources, but then their governments are agreeing to buy electric power at the expense of what happens to them downstream. So there was that, you know, tensions. And that's when I really started to look. And so even as much as I say I'm an environmentalist, I see myself as an environmental, social, and political activist, just because when you see governments discussing politically about the purchase of energy, which is an economic conversation, but not thinking about what is the social aspects to communities, and not realizing this political decisions that are made, economic decisions that are made, have, you know, huge impacts for local communities, who then start to fight amongst themselves, not understanding the different layers of things that are happening. So that's where really my journey began, as an oops. And right now, literally everything I read, I analyze from that perspective of who's making this decision, who's making an interest, what's the private sector, and really what's the impact, and who's really bearing the impacts.
Yes, yeah, that's really interesting. So you're reading everything with a critical eye. So going back to the hydroelectric dam, so this was one of the biggest hydroelectric dam projects in Africa, yeah? And is it correct that you actually spoke with the World Bank and you were able to curtail some of that funding? Maybe if you could explain how that process was.
In my naivety, those days I used to think you have a case, you go to the bank, you go to the person, you ask a question, and it ends there. But it took me 4 or 5 years to sit in meetings, and everything was about interest. I went to the African Development Bank meetings asking colleagues who were demonstrating against the Grand Inga Dam, which is the largest in Africa. And if you look at the Grand Inga, ideally it is a dam that is built to extract minerals. It's basically power to take it to the mines to extract minerals. So when we were looking about, we were talking to the World Bank, European Investment Bank, and the African Development Bank, it was really looking at what is it that they haven't done. So it wasn't that it was wrong or right. You are literally looking at what are their policies around their financing that would make them withdraw the funding. And so it was really talking about the indigenous people's policies, and the lack of an environmental, social, and impact assessment. For the first time, you actually are happy that somebody did something wrong, and you can use that to make a case against the bank. So that's what we did.
Okay, and you had to establish Friends of Lake Turkana to be able to do that.
initially when we started Friends of Lake Turkana, it was really a campaign pressure group. And then, about 2011 to then, do a court case, there has to be an entity. And so we then decided to set up the Friends of Lake Turkana.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. If you would like to move on to your second talk, and then we will be taking questions from chat. So please, if anyone has anything that they would like to ask Ikal, this will be your time.
So as I was saying about the linkages between the good stuff that we will celebrate in places like, electric this and electric that, renewable energy, wind farms. We have the largest wind farm in Africa, just, across the lake. But we, and people will say, yes, it's not, we are, this is, right now they think there's a lot of monitoring of emissions, and that's the focus. But then no one is monitoring how much land has been taken over for mining that would then contribute to the just transition. It's a direction I'm taking. So I've always looked at knowledge production as a capitalist society. So you can imagine, Zarina, when you said that before around capitalism and competition, what I was thinking to myself, like, really, did she just read my mind? So just the analysis around where knowledge production, what is knowledge production, and how knowledge production is linked to a capitalist society and is confined to the elites. So we're, thinking around who has access to the spaces where knowledge is produced. We are all researchers, and God knows we all want resources for research here and there. But then who's funding the research? Who's funding the higher education? And how then, who determines, who determines what out of the research gets out and what is stopped from getting out? Because then it's that whole concept of the process of knowledge production, who's accessing it, who's producing it. But it also goes to a situation, as look at the colonialization of knowledge production. And it is something that, when I think about my own research, the role of traditional and oral narratives in contributing to the knowledge production, how we recognize traditional and indigenous knowledge within knowledge production. And in that, we have to think about how we democratize the production of knowledge, which will elevate, which will really bring out the whole idea of indigenous knowledge, because democratization of education and knowledge production will then allow Jennifer to bring her Kamba descent and her Scottish descent to a space where she's saying, this is what I have known growing up. So when, in a classroom, allow for a debate around, do I throw out the baby with the bathwater about what I've known my entire life? Because we tend to force a particular way of knowledge production that is determined by somebody. In Kenya now, we have a change in the education system, and it keeps changing. We keep trying to what is called competency-based. Ideally, I keep saying it is an education system that churns out less critical thinkers, more employees. And who then determines, which education system we go into. But it's really critical for us to ask ourselves around corporate funding and private funding for research, especially within the universities. So that, and I'm leading this to the just transition because the biggest, hardest discussion around the just transition is around jobs. And everyone's just talking about whether it's green jobs and, thinking about how many miners will probably lose jobs. Because even in that, it's just looked at as jobs, but not thinking around how do we take them on board? Again, going back to what Professor Watson was saying, we cannot, because the people, the workers within the fossil companies are just but mere workers. They're everyday citizens like us. They're not the corporation. They don't own a share in that corporation. So how are we taking them on board so that when they are resisting it, they're not resisting it because they don't want a clean environment. They're resisting it because it means the food they put on the table for their kids. It means their kids, just like our kids, need to go to school. So how is it that we bring them on board and have a very hard but critical conversation that really says, for us to go as a people, we have to all go together. The African saying, to go far, you go alone. To go farther, you go with the people. And it's no point fighting each other and saying them versus us, because we're all working peoples. The same people working in the wind farm have the same, they're working peoples. They don't own a share in the wind farm. as the people working in the mines. And that's why that discussion around how, the knowledge production and how we make sure that that education is a political tool, that when you're in a classroom learning about the mining sector, you're not just doing it because you want to be a miner. You're just doing it so that you can think about what does it look like to still take out the lithium, but in a way that does not fragment that ecosystem, that in a way that, yes, because these same minerals will be needed for the renewable energy. How are we going to do it without necessarily having to take huge tracts of land to take up a little bit of minerals? Do we need all those minerals to do this? What are the options that we have? Because then we are sort of, it stops being you versus us and really thinks around how, for me, I think education, and I think many people think education is a political tool, and capital knows it. So education institutions become a place of legitimizing the power or domination or challenging it. And I think the space for education where those who think, the diverse opinions of students, the diverse opinion of students is going to be a very critical part where they can argue out and say, and that's how, new innovations will come. Yes, we have to mine for lithium, perhaps. I don't know. I'm waiting for somebody who will tell me there's a substitute to lithium, it's a substitute to cobalt. But how are we going to mine it? What are the options that we have? And how do we come together, environmentalists, water experts, cultural experts, different, statistics, all the different cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, actors, to be able to challenge and bring out a new form of education. It's a new form of education, but it's radicalized the education system that is able to unpack these questions that many of us, my age, activists of this space, don't want to discuss. Because when you say, but renewable energy is still fragmenting ecosystems, and everybody sees as if you're a weaker anti-fossil activist. It's not that. It's just that there's a reality around it. And I think the knowledge that is produced now from a lot of the young people who are seeing these things, but also linking it to food systems, to water systems, to gender, and the way the role of gender in all this is going to be a very critical way to look at it. And that's why that disruption of the current way that we are made to think. I must say, when I was starting to do my PhD, the aspect of doing an engaged and activist approach was not very easy to convince professors around it. It's like, why, how? And we all know the tensions around it. But it's that radical thinking that the reason I'm even bothering to do a PhD is to really take and elevate the activist arguments in an academic setup. So I think it's going to be very critical to radicalize and allow for multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary work amongst, within the education spaces, and allow for that diverse thinking that will be able to start to, radically reshape our social and economic order. And because that, for me, is the center of a just transition. Because there is no way you're going to talk about a just transition as a climate crisis on its own. We have got to be able to look at economic order and the economic and social order. And this is linked to addressing and radically transforming and democratizing the public systems, public water, public education, public public, and the food systems, public healthcare. As we have seen in this particular case, the private, in Kenya, for example, initially to get a COVID test, most of the private hospitals had access to everything that were needed to get a COVID test. The public ones didn't. Yet 80% of the population can only afford the public health system. Sadly, with COVID, most people lost jobs. Most places were closed down. That meant if you were able to do private, your insurance was cut, so you have to go to public. And I think really going back to that, securing and liberating the public systems is going to be very critical to work towards an economic disruption of the economic and transformation of the economic and social order, which then is linked to the education system. Because if the education system is public, then you can see the agenda and the interest where citizens can actually demand from the state rather than, because if it's private, there's no state in that. And so your agenda of a radicalized economic and social order is limited to the private sector. And that is not going to happen. So we have to find ways to take it back to the public, take it back to state support, which is really our taxpayers' money, and then restart to think how we build, not build back, but how we rebuild with, even if it means creating a new foundation from the beginning. That's what's going to be very critical for us to see our efforts and our contributions towards a just transition.
Okay, thank you very much, Ikal. I think we'll move to some questions from the chat. So we'll start with Mark Langdon. Is the higher education system in the UK taking part of the continuing process of colonialization by charging huge fees to students from the global south and supporting neoliberal perspectives in the knowledge reproduction process and the exclusion of indigenous knowledge?
If I was to answer that question and someone was to pay my fees, I'd be very happy. But anywho, yes, I mean, it's a huge, I don't see it happening. I think, I really don't, I mean, the discussion around decolonization, it's not a pure full agenda, in my opinion. I feel that it is specific universities trying, and even within the universities, you find specific departments making an effort towards it. So you find one department within my university, I think the School of Business School, is fighting a whole redundancy issue, etc., and this whole knowledge production situation. Yet the Department of Geography, where I sit, is somewhat looking like as if they're actually having a decolonization agenda, just even by seeing my current research and how I'm doing it, and using my own local knowledge as part of my academic reference. That's being seen, but I think it's not there are different pieces here and there.
Okay, that's great. So we have our next question from Sonia. How do you engage people with vested interest in, how do you engage people with vested interest in or who benefit from the status quo? So neoliberal knowledge production and exchange.
I'd say we need to have, so we tend to sometimes just argue from their interests only. I think we need to, we know what we don't want. We need to find ways that we come together for what we want and start to produce that knowledge and put it out there in the public for common good and use that to then engage them. So from a point of, because you know what they want, you know what their interests are. So I feel that there are very many good people out there who tend to engage with the knowledge that's produced by the people with vested interests. So if we put efforts together as great and good, energetic people, we would then have more platforms from which then they would have to engage with our data. I mean, I give this example. The push for renewable energy has pushed the likes of Shell to have renewable energy. Is this a good thing? I'm a little worried because you do realize that they have not changed their economic interests. They have not changed the way they treat the environment. It's just going to be in a renewable format. So we have got to start to have many people writing about these things and saying it's not the shift of technology by the likes of Shell. It is, you've got to change your entire being, including what you think about the environment, not just, and what you think about economics and social aspects and the corporate interest within it. So there's got to be a lot of that being done. I hope I answered it.
That's great, thank you. And we've had 3 questions that are quite similar. So how would you define a just transition? And then more specifically, how would you define a just transition for the people of surrounding Lake Turkana?
Two things. As I said, just transition means you're looking at the economy of people, their social aspects, political aspects, their political aspirations. It's not going to be about changing the energy systems. I say this from a place where if anybody has seen any work done in Africa, we keep talking about energy saving jikos, energy saving, you know, cooking systems. Yet most of the reasons why people burn charcoal in rural Africa is not for them to use. They do not use the charcoal, they sell it. So if you don't address why they sell it, they don't, you know, so you're thinking they're burning charcoal, so we should give them energy saving jikos. Yet you'll find the energy saving jikos stored aside and they will use one piece of wood and that's it. So you've got to really, we've got to all think about, you know, what is it that is development for them? And for us, because I'm sitting in rural Africa, you know, so what is rural, what is actual development? And with that, then be able to say, what are we transitioning to? Are we producing, I give an example, the largest wind farm in the eastern shores of Lake Turkana. It is a big, everyone says it's a great project, it's supported by very many partners, but it produces energy that goes to the main grid, away from the community, and then it will be brought back to the community years later at a higher cost than they can afford. Communities don't, even when you look at the land that is taken for this, it is a PPP between state, private sector, and the company. But then the land belongs to the community. So why couldn't we have a CPPP perhaps? Because then the communities are giving land as natural capital, and that means they are shareholders in the company, in the business that is being designed, and they can make a decision about how things are done. I think, so for us to have a just transition, it's got to be about democratization of energy. So it's not about just a nice energy project there. We've got to democratize energy so that the landowners, the territorial owners are owners of those projects. That it's not about a bit of CSR thrown at them, a toilet here, a classroom there, but they are really owning those sort of projects. I think that's what, because then that takes care of economic, it deals with the social relations, but also looks at the futuristic contribution that this communities and we as communities can have in the development agenda, and perhaps even the political agenda, but mostly it also gives power, real power to communities, because then their land becomes natural capital in all this. And in the case of Turkana, I mean, it's the same thing in the case of Turkana and Global South. It really goes back to that. I think for that particular example, I mean, in 2012, we asked the company, instead of giving the community because the compensation that the company gives communities is 150 euros for land taken from them, individual households. If you calculate it together, it barely gets to 2,000 euros. Even if at max, it's, let's say, 5,000 euros. With that, does that qualify as compensation for the economy is lost? Does that address the social impacts that these communities have had? It doesn't. And so you find it's very piecemeal and mostly seen as you're already poor, so what worse can we do to you?
Right, Zarina, over to you. It's your question.
Yeah, so Ikal, I've got a question for you. So I was just wondering, you as a woman, because you hit on it earlier on, you were talking about gender and having gender disruption, but as a woman, how has your position in what you've been doing, how have you been impacted, and has there been a struggle? Have there been challenges? Have you found resistance, resilience, or has that been a positive place, and that you feel as being a woman, you've actually been able to do more? And it actually relates to something else that one of the other participants were asking as well, and they were asking about gender inequality and gender equality and what role that's played out in the transition.
So I've used it. So I was prepared for the backlash of being, my gender. So I sort of went in guns blazing, ready. And in most cases, at the local level, again, it's a patriarchal community. I could see it, but then I didn't, I saw it as a plus, because it was already seen as, you're a woman, you're going to be emotional, you're going to do this, but I just embraced it. So I didn't, because I feel that sometimes we spend so much time denying it. I'm a woman, it's not changing. So I'm going to be there, I'm going to engage with you from my place and use what I feel as a woman and the impacts that this fragmentation, this inequalities have on women to explain my struggle. And so that's what I've kept doing. It has had its challenges, I think, mostly from peers. It's funny, it's not even from the other interests. It's usually from peers who feel that you have to be a certain woman kind of person, married with. I've had a situation where some colleagues asked a community why they listen to me, an unmarried woman. And luckily for me, the community said, but she's our child. Didn't really matter, married or not, she's our child. So it worked for me. But I get that here and there, but I've used it as a strength, because then I'm able to use what I feel. And one of my colleagues who's here would always say, former colleagues who would always say, when a madman walks around the streets and talks, people look and move away. When a woman shouts on the streets, mad or not, people tend to listen. So I use that more.
Right, brilliant, thank you. Okay, we've got another question in the chat. So it's questions from Sandra, and it says, how do we promote having enough and not encourage greed? Or is greed part of some people's makeup?
We are in a capitalist space. It's primitive accumulation. It's not even just, greed and, yeah, it's greed and primitive accumulation. It's that tendency to take more than you have, but it's mostly linked in, it's not on the streets, because greed for a hyena is just taking and taking. You eat and you get your gluttony. But this one is not even greed, it's primitive accumulation that's linked to a financial market. So the financialization of everything, a financialization of food, it has linked to a financial system. So you will take for speculation purpose that perhaps if I hold it for a few years, it will fetch more. You will see even right now with COVID, somebody somewhere is calculating how much they can make out of the COVID situation because it is a short duration of time. And it's because we are and that's why we never put a sustainability. And I've been asked this, sustainable for whom and for how, what's sustainable? And so the continuous taking up of much more. So yes, and that's why I say small is beautiful. That's why people build grand infrastructure, grand everything, because no one sees as small is beautiful. So it is possible, but it takes a total disruption of that economic and social order, because and if you've come from a situation where it's collective, things were collective. The African society, we used to harvest and share, but right now you harvest and you keep, whether they get weevils or not, you just keep and hope that you will sell to the next person because they don't have. So it's just that need to get more, but linked really to a financial system and a financialized, we have financialized a social relations, financialized social system that makes people want to take up more.
Okay, Ikal, we're really firing the questions at you. Where and what importance do you think that we as educators should be placing upon increasing levels of economic literacy against what we're currently delivering?
That's a hard question, Callum, but I will try. I think that everything, my first day in my master's class, and I was talking about policy, and my professor said, until the day you realize that every policy has got to have an economic rationale, I think that's what's going to help us. For that economic literacy to, one, it's linked to a reality. We will not try and romanticize this commons and collective and public good, but recognizing that we've got to be able to let people understand that the food systems are the way they are because of, if you do it this way, it means that somebody misses out on it and somebody is the one who's controlling it. It's not really only economic literacy, it's a political economy literacy, in my opinion, that is needed. Because then you can talk about the costs involved, but then if you don't relate it to who's benefiting from the costs involved, then you give the person a very skewed level of understanding around it. I think that's what, in my opinion, would need to be brought out. And it helps when educators decide that the system is not working for them and they want their students, they want the rest of the public to join in holding to account and demanding the right systems to be put in place, because then the rest of the people don't understand why educators are going on strike. It is only until they can see the political and economic relations and how all this is linked to the way, the public system works, the way the health system is working, the way, food prices are going higher and things like that. I feel that it's only going to be through that. I don't know how realistic this is, but I think political economy should be, in a way, included in every aspect of education.
Okay, fabulous. And we have time for one more question. So I think I'm going to ask you my question. So in terms of Indigenous rights and resource extraction, are there any particular examples or nations, countries where you think they're doing it right and that we can learn from?
I always think someone is doing it right, then I get disappointed. I think the fact that some countries have put in place the right to free, prior, informed consent is something that I recognize so much as a plus. Even within Indigenous people, I have to recognize that we are not homogeneous. Even within, our biggest problems within Indigenous communities is the Indigenous elite, because they're the ones who understand what a mine means or what the products of the mine are. So they're the ones who would be the problem. We have seen some gains here and there in various parts. I was talking to a colleague about in a time when COVID has hit and extraction has reduced, and yet we're getting wins. I think it was in Peru. Yes, in Peru, where they won a case against the state and the company that denied the communities free, prior, informed consent. So you can see a lot of gains in places like Peru. But at the same time, we see a lot of initial gains we are losing out on those gains based on this new need to extract. I think even as we discuss the just transition, you're seeing African countries and parts of the global south weakening their laws that would allow for an increase and expanded extraction, because there's a fear that they will have a lot of stored assets if then they wait for too long for extraction to happen. So there's an expansive, and it's much easier to get in and extract now, because they think that we have to do this before everyone becomes, uses an electric car. That's for the oil companies. And then we just have to weaken it to allow, because right now there's less investments in the extraction sector. So I think there's places you can learn like Peru, but we have to keep working on them. Even where we have good examples, we have to keep working towards better examples in these areas.
That's great. Okay, thank you so much, and thank you for asking our quite wide variety of questions. If you can give us your closing statement, that would be fabulous. Thank you.
Well, do I have a closing statement? I think for me, it goes back to continued efforts. It will take, I'm glad that you're looking at this work from the education sector. We just have to keep thinking around how we produce knowledge, who produces the knowledge, where it is produced, and how, again, I go back to Professor Watson, how we continue opening up the spaces of knowledge production so that no one is excluded. It is one thing to say, leave no one behind in a statement, but actually leave many behind. So, and I think once you start from the spaces of knowledge production, how they are, and including Indigenous knowledge, we will go a long way in really disrupting the system and building back great, not needing back better, but just building a great world for everybody. And loving that, Scotland and colleagues in Scotland are, pushing back on business as usual is to me very, very impressive and energizing in this work. So let's keep, working together and building spaces that we can continue to disrupt. For me, we have to be a bit radical. And education is one of the places that really needs to be radicalized. So thank you very much.
Great. And Ikal, you mentioned energizing. I feel that your talk today has been really energizing. So a brilliant way for us to start the day. Again, thank you so much.